Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar on the role of social partners in upskilling and reskilling for the twin transition, organized by the Global Deal Unit. For those of you who don't know the Global Deal partnership already, let me say a few words. So the partnership, the Global Deal Partnership for Inclusive Growth and Decent Work brings together governments, employers representatives, workers representatives, and civil society to produce evidence, evidence-based research, to share knowledge, to facilitate also policy discussions like we are having today, and to strengthen the capacity of partners of the Global Deal to engage in social dialogue. At this event, we are really giving the floor to Global Deal partners precisely to discuss the impact of the combined digital and green transitions on labor markets and on skill demands, and discuss the role that social dialogue can have, and also put forward some examples of good practice. In fact, the twin transition has a lot of potential to make things better, to create employment. It is changing the way we work, the content of jobs, what we work on. And in the medium to long term, I think most studies show that it will bring more employment, more inclusive growth by fostering innovation, increasing productivity, and also creating potentially quality jobs. But in the short term, the fear is that there might be losers and that the twin transition will disrupt labor markets. And in this context, upskilling and reskilling is going to be key for managing the disruptions, for facilitating transitions of adults who are losing their jobs as a result of the transition and having to move to different industries or different occupations. We still know little, let's say, about the actual impact of the green transitional labor market. And just as we thought we were starting to get a handle on the impact of the digital transition on labor markets, then let's say we're now grappling with trying to understand what ChatGPT and generative AI more generally, how they are affecting the picture that we have in mind, how they're going to complicate that picture that we had developed over the years. So in both cases, if you want, there are still some analysis to be done in terms of the actual impact on employment and on skills requirements as a result. What we know is that, and it's at the heart of what we're going to discuss today, is that for any action to be successful, we'll need to bring together all the actors that are involved. And in the skills area in particular, there are many stakeholders involved. There's government and several ministers within government, Ministry of Education, Ministries of Employment. In the case of the green transition, often ministries of the environment as well, and in some countries, ministries that deal with productivity, investments in firms, innovation, and so on. And of course, on the side of in the workplace, the involvement of the social partners is key. So then we have employers involved, we have workers' representatives involved, and then we have civil society, many civil society organizations involved in both transitions. So through social dialogue, we can better understand, so also work together on understanding the changes that are upcoming, designing and implementing better adult learning policies, and also being able to target the adults who are most affected by the disruption that's brought about by the twin transition. Without further ado, let me introduce Anja Meyerkop, who is a labor economist in the skills team at the OECD in the skills and employability division, with a long experience of working on adult learning, and she is the main author of the brief and will present the key findings. Anja, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Glenda, for the introduction and the opportunity to present here. I will just share my screen and you can let me know if it's not displayed correctly. Give me a second. So this should be fine. Perfect. So I'm going to present the key messages of this new Global Deal thematic brief, as Glenda has already outlined, on upskilling and reskilling for the twin transition. And my plan for this presentation is I will first clarify briefly again, what we mean by the twin transition, how it affects structural change in the labor market. Then I will show that the systems that are currently in existence on upskilling and reskilling of adults in many countries are not yet, shall we say, fully ready to support workers and enterprises in this twin transition. And then I want to go and present some of the good practices that are collected in this booklet, how social partners together with governments can strengthen upskilling and reskilling systems. So let's start with the definition. So at the OECD, we think a lot about how megatrends are reshaping labor markets around the world. And through this work, we understand that there is growing interest, as Glenda has already said, among policymakers in how the greening of the economy will affect jobs, the jobs we do and how we do them. And at the same time, the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the use of technology to digitalize non-digital products, services, and processes. And also, as also Glenda already alluded to, these recent advances in artificial intelligence have opened up the possibility of automating more complex tasks maybe than we previously thought possible. So these two trends together are what is often referred to as the twin transition. And the idea is that they can reinforce each other. So for example, digitalization can improve resource efficiency. Think about, the smart meter in your home that might automatically adjust energy use and adjust the temperature in your flat, but they can also conflict with each other. For example, in the case of very energy intensive technologies, such as blockchain technologies, for example. But what is clear is that this twin transition is really driving structural change. So that means it is changing the relative importance of sectors, occupations, jobs, and the skills in the economy. So these structural changes require many individuals to update their skill set as demand for the existing skills in the labor market changes. And at the OECD, we're working with governments and social partners around the world. And it's obvious that they're very keen to design effective policies that help workers adapt to these changing skill requirements, help them transition to new sectors, and ultimately provide businesses as well with the skills they need to succeed in the green and digital economy. So are the global systems for upskilling and reskilling ready for this challenge? We did a big publication on this a few years ago, but I just want to pull out some data on participation, because the data on participation shows that despite this growing need for upskilling, participation of adult learning hasn't changed that much over the past decade. Okay, you can say maybe the data that's presented here is slightly impacted by the COVID crisis, and you still have lower participation based on that. But what you can see here is labor force survey data on adult participation in education and training in 2011 and in 2021. And you can see that today around 15% of adults in OECD countries participate in training every month. And this is only a small increase from a decade earlier, when an average of 13% of adults participated in learning in every month. Of course, the differences between countries, you can see here on the left-hand side, Finland and Sweden with very high participation rates in 2021, over 30%, while Greece and Slovakia on the other end here on the right-hand side of the slide had rates below 5%. In addition, the participation of different socioeconomic groups in learning is extremely unequal. And this is the case across the OECD. I'm presenting some data that's average data across OECD countries for which data is available. But there are really huge differences in learning participation between those with low and high skill levels, between younger and older workers, but also, for example, between those working in smaller and larger enterprises. And I guess what should worry us, or what could worry us, is that those most in need of up and reskilling, because their jobs are changing most, are the least likely to participate. So if you look at the left-hand side here, the gap between the low skilled and high skilled is particularly wide. Only 8% of those that only have lower secondary education, so you might also call them school dropouts, or those people with low qualification levels, participate in learning, compared to 22% of those with tertiary education. So nearly 3 times as much as those with low qualification levels. So maybe more needs to be done. And I think a lot of governments and social partners are aware that more needs to be done. So everyone agrees on this, but it's less clear how this can be achieved in practice. But what we know from our work is that we can see that stakeholder involvement in general, so that's social partners, but also civil society more widely, is crucial for successful upskilling and reskilling policies. And of course, with much adult learning taking part in the workplace, social partners have a particularly important role to play. So there is, for example, some qualitative evidence from recent research we've done at the OECD that shows that their involvement has a positive impact on the performance of skill system. It can make them more resilient. It can ensure that policies are not only conceived, but also successfully implemented, because we need the buy-in of social partners to do that. But we also know that the involvement of social partners varies widely across OECD members and also beyond, from some countries where social partners have a very active role in the management of the system, including responsibility for funding, for delivering training opportunities, to having a less active, more consultative role in some countries. And you can find an overview of these differences in the briefing, and I'm sure we will hear more about those different models in our panel discussion later on. Finally, it's important to consider that informality and new forms of work, such as platform and own account workers, challenge the role of social partners, because, of course, with decreasing trade union density, with more diverse career pathways, with less strong connections between employers and their workers, governments are increasingly considering individual rather than collective solutions to skill development. So, we've all, I think, heard a lot about individual learning accounts. So that's something that empowers individuals to take care of their own learning, but kind of does stir attention away a little bit from collective solutions of education and training. So what are good practices? A lot of the space in this publication is dedicated to good practices on how social dialogue can work and where it works well along the skills policy cycle. And as Glenda said in the introduction, the involvement of social partners, reaches from being involved in the very early stages of trying to understand what skills are actually needed in the labor market, through setting strategies on adult learning, financing, delivering training, to quality assurance. So I just want to give you a bit of a taste of where social partners can be involved and what good practices are in these different steps. So as already said, the first step is this area of skills assessment and anticipation, the assessment of skill needs for the twin transition. And for a long time already now, skills anticipation and assessment exercises have included considerations for the digital transition, but they're also increasingly looking into considerations for the green transition. So how does this impact the skills? Which jobs are greening? What are green jobs? How many of them are there, etc. So those are all considerations that are more and more made in OECD member countries and beyond. And we also know that social partners are already involved in these exercises. So in 2 out of 3 OECD countries, they are involved in anticipating skills, although again, as before, the extent of their involvement varies. We're highlighting skills councils here as a good practice. Skill councils are independent bodies that provide a forum for exchange to discuss skill supply, demand, and related policy responses. They are often sectoral, but they can also be regional. And one example that I want to highlight here is South Africa's 21 sector education and training authorities. And I'm sure we will hear more about this in the discussion from our colleague from South Africa. So I won't say much about this, but it's a very successful model of how on a sector level, social partners can collaborate and engage in the anticipation of skill needs. So the next step really in this policy cycle of skill policy making is based on this identified skill needs. Social partners can also be involved in developing adult learning strategies. So adult learning strategies are a tool for improving coherence in this policy area that's very often fragmented. There's a lot of people involved. There's a lot of different stakeholders. So most OECD countries have some kind of adult learning strategy to define objectives and set out actions to reach these objectives. They can be standalone, so sometimes they're called adult learning strategies or skill strategies, or they can be embedded in other strategies such as industrial or digital skilled strategies, etc. A good practice in this area is the National Skill Strategy in Germany. This was launched in 2019. It brings together commitments on adult learning around 10 overarching objectives. And the key part here as well was that it was developed through a process of tripartite social dialogue with really broad buy-in, including from professional organizations, chambers of commerce, etc. The next area of where social partner involvement can be observed and is important is in negotiating training rights. So we do see that upskilling and reskilling are increasingly considerations in collective bargaining. So that might involve training rights, financing, leave arrangements, job protection during or after training. Those are all things that we do increasingly see in collective agreements. But while the proportion of enterprises covered by collective agreements has increased over the past decades in European OECD countries, that's what we have data for through the continuing vocational training survey. We also know that there is room for improvement because it's still only about 18% of enterprises that are covered by a collective agreement that has a reference to training in 2020. Again, big difference between countries. So in France and Portugal, 3 out of 4 companies, 3 out of 4 companies are covered by such an agreement in France and Portugal, and almost no companies are covered by such an agreement in Greece and Latvia and Poland. So very different models across those countries for which data is available. Looking at good practices, and I think we'll hear more about that again later in the panel because it's a very interesting example. There has been a big Swedish cross-sectoral agreement on skills development, transition, and employment protection, which came into effect in October last year. And it's a very interesting one in which really the training for protecting workers from future changes, for getting them ready for future changes played a big role. So I'm keen to hear more about that later in the panel discussion. The fourth area that social partners can be involved in very actively is actually in the provision of training itself. And we do see this in many countries in the OECD and beyond. So, for example, we know that employers often provide certified training through professional associations, which are often actually very highly valued in specific industries and in specific sectors, because it's employers coming together and kind of defining the standards, delivering the training and then certifying them. But it's also trade unions that can use their close links with their members to provide training, and they do in many countries, particularly for workers who are maybe typically less likely to participate, but for whom that contact with the trade union can be an entryway to actually kind of looking at their skill development needs and then taking the steps to satisfy those needs. And a good example here comes from Brazil, where the National Confederation of Industry operates a network of, I think, about 700 nonprofit secondary vocational schools with a very wide coverage across the country. And actually, I think in 2015, the network provided training to more than 35% of all workers in the manufacturing sector. So really a very big impact, a very wide reach of a kind of social partner run training network. The next question that we're often asked, or one of the questions we're most often asked in our work is, but who should pay for all of this up and reskilling if it's so necessary? And I guess our general view is that, training does benefit individuals, employers, and also society. So the cost should be shared across these groups, although to different extents, depending on specific circumstances of the individual and also the types of training provided. But social partners' involvement in the funding of upskilling and reskilling often takes place through training funds, which bring together money collected through training levies, so payroll taxes. And in many countries, such as Italy, for example, social partners are then entrusted with the management of these funds. So they really have a very active role in administering the finances that are needed for upskilling and reskilling for the transition. So in Italy, for example, there are sectoral social partners that are overseeing the management of interprofessional training funds, and these funds are worth 600 million euros a year, so really a very big implications. And our research suggests that these need to be quite carefully designed because they need to ensure equity, and companies often tend to prioritize training for groups with higher returns, and smaller companies find it harder to tap into these resources. So there are some considerations for the design of these training funds, but overall, we consider them a very good practice internationally. And then Finally, a significant proportion of adult learning takes place informally at work. We know this through learning by doing, through learning from colleagues. So social partners also have an active role to play in creating supportive learning environments. And in some countries, governments actually support the development of such practices. So Australia has been at the forefront of this. So already in 1991, they introduced this best practice demonstration program, which provided funding for exemplary companies to develop high performance work practice. And this program was also established through tripartite cooperation. And the very last point, the very last step, I guess, in the skills policy cycle I want to make is social partners can also be involved in ensuring the quality of adult learning provision. So this can include them being involved on boards of education providers, on sitting on local or sectoral quality assurance bodies, and also being represented in national quality assurance agencies. And one of the examples from the publication is this good practice that we've observed in Flanders in Belgium, where social partners are directly responsible for the certification of sectoral training and also represented on the board of the Flemish Certification Commission. So far from me, much more detail on this topic can be found in the brief, and including many more good practices from the OECD area and beyond. I just want to thank you for now, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of the Global DEAL partners discuss if this resonated with them, what they agree with, what they agree with less with, and I'm handing back to Glenda on this.
And as Anya said, the brief is already available online, so we remind you of the link. And I'm delighted now to introduce our panel discussion with Global DEAL partners, including social partners, government representatives, as well as our colleagues from the ILO. So as Anya said, we want to hear whether the brief resonates with you, so whether you agree with our findings, where our panel participants think the social dialogue in upskilling and reskilling for the twin transition is working well, and where there is room for improvement, which areas we can do better, where the challenges are emerging. So let me introduce the panelists. So I will start with Ms. Mamfoku Kuluve, who joins us from South Africa, where she's the Director of System Monitoring and Labor Market Intelligence at the Department of Higher Education and Training. Thanks a lot, Manfo, for agreeing to participate in the panel. Then we have Pedro Moreno de Fonseca from the ILO, where he's a specialist on lifelong learning. Hello, Pedro. Thanks for joining. Valeria Ronzitti, who is the Secretary General of SGI Europe, the European Association representing enterprises which carry out services of general interest. Thank you, Valeria. And then last but not least, Mr. Klaes Michael Stahl, who is Deputy General Secretary at the European Trade Union Confederation, which represents workers at the European level. So welcome to you all. I think it's important, I'm encouraging you again to ask questions for the panelists. Also, if you have any questions following Anya's presentation, you can put them in the chat, and hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end of the discussion to answer those questions. So the brief highlights the role of social partners in effective systems for upskilling and reskilling adults in the twin transition. So my first question is for Pedro, to see whether what we say in the brief is in line with the research you're doing at the ILO, and for your experience, what is the extent nowadays of involvement of social partners in policy making in this particular area of the transition to a digital and more sustainable economy?
Thank you, Glenda. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is an especially dear subject to us, being the only tripartite agency of the United Nations. Therefore, we really enjoy the fact that you are promoting, let's say, this important action, social dialogue to address the twin transition. I think that there is a significant role being played, and social partners in general play a significant role in the development of skills and lifelong learning systems. I mean, we are still now during the International Labour Conference, where we have just approved the text of a recommendation on quality apprenticeship. So we're going to have a standard which couldn't have been achieved without the participation cooperation of the social partners and the active engagement. And I think that speaking to the brief specifically, I think the brief, of course, addresses a lot of the key issues, identifies a lot of the key aspects in which social partners can, let's say, have a relevant intervention. I think that this intervention, this engagement is stronger and more widespread in some of these areas than others. I think we can identify many cases in which there is production, dissemination of labor market information, or the creation of and updating of qualifications, but other topics are a bit less clear, you know, like how much, what is the degree of engagement in national strategies and policies? It's extremely variable. For example, the engagement in the funding of the system and all the governance of funding is also very diversified. So I think that some points are stronger than others. I believe we'll have the opportunity to discuss a bit more. But I would like also to highlight also the relevance that the engagement of social partners has for the advancement of social justice and for a just transition. And that's a role that is to a certain extent being played, but not necessarily as strong as it can be. I think just to focus very quickly a few aspects, I think one important aspect is the support of vulnerable groups and individuals into lifelong learning incentives, which has a lot to do with the targeting of the development of specific skill sets or packages of incentives that address specific groups, the mapping and support to critical pathways of reskilling, for example, that allow worker mobility, worker migration, etc., linked to this transition. Another aspect that I think can and should be underlined is the quality of the training offer, and specifically of the digital training offer, which is exploding right now in terms of especially short digital training offer, which requires an effort in terms of partnerships, credentialing, quality assurance, etc. And lastly, also, and I'll finish now, the extent to which micro, small and medium enterprises are also being taken into account in the measures that are being developed, and which also can be a topic that can deserve social partner attention.
Points you make, particularly at the end, are very relevant. And now let me move on to Klaus Michael at the ETUC, which represents, as I said before, workers in decision-making at the European level. Is this your assessment, particularly in terms of the priority that Pedro mentioned at the end, like identifying pathways related to the transition, in particular monitoring the training that's being created for the transition, which is exploding in terms of offers? So very good point on the quality, the particular support to SMEs and to vulnerable groups that Pedro has mentioned. So do you agree with that? And to what extent do you think it's important to involve unions in this area?
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting us to participate in this work in this meeting today. And first of all, yes, I agree with, I think, almost everything that Pedro said. So and I don't think I have much to add in that way. What I could add, and what I want to add to some extent, is the importance, the profound. I only have one argument really, and that is involve social partners in upskilling and reskilling. And I would say there are three reasons for this. First of all, we know the market. We are buyers and sellers of labor. We know where there is lack. We know where there is a surplus. And as buyers and sellers of labor, we are very much knowledgeable of the market at large, and also what's happening when it comes to dealing with change. because that's what we're doing. We're dealing with change, and that's a constant on our labor market and the life at large, I think. The second reason to involve us is to legitimize what's happening. So some people, well, most people, I would say almost all people, don't want change to happen to them, like you become a victim. You want to be part of what's happening, because that's also when change becomes real and manageable in a way. So that's the involvement of social partners, and I think at workplaces and societies at large, that's when you get successful transformation is through making things well, shortly involve people. So that's the second reason to have social partners closely involved in this process. Third one is something that you also mentioned, Pedro, and that's justice. Justice in that way that we include those that are probably most in need of good transition rules. Blue-collar workers, people that work at factories, low wage paid jobs, and so on, to make them part of this. And also ensure that the possibilities at the labor market and in life is fairly distributed. So that's something we can contribute with. And I hope I can come back later on and say something about what happened in Sweden. I was part in those negotiations, but I also think it's very important to make good conditions for upskilling and reskilling, because that's when things happen. You can have many rights and so on, but if it's not really possible because the training is not reimbursed or something like that, won't happen. So that's what I would like to say at this stage. Thank you.
I beg to differ on the first point. Do we really see, are we sure that social partners and governments alike are always know how skills are changing, what their needs are? Because our research tends to show that although we think, employers have a good visibility on what the strategies are, for example, and what they should invest in, the two don't seem to coincide. So when we look at data and we look at what they are saying, where they are saying they want to go, and what they invest in doesn't always match. And also, there's the point that Pedro was making before about SMEs, and Anya made it as well in her presentation. So a lot of the work shows that, if you're an SME, the idea that we have, which of course in principle you are right, employers and workers representatives should know what's going on in the workplace. They are the best placed, but there's still caveats there, because we know that for a lot of SMEs are talking about, assessing the skills of their workers, providing training to address skill gaps is still very exotic. Partly because of the skills of management in SMEs, and for many other reasons. They're very small. Even if they're aware, sending people on training is very challenging. But so I think there's some caveats I would add some caveats on your first point.
So yeah, but well, I guess it's a bit like democracy. It's the best of the worst.
Yes.
And of course, there are no perfect systems for assessing what exactly down at each and individual level. But I do think that we together are probably the best option in that way, because as I said, we are buyers and sellers of labor, and I think in the mix between those two forces that meet, make collective bargaining, so you will get probably the best assessment. Is it perfect? No. Is it good? Yes. Probably the best of the worst.
Absolutely, I agree. So let's move on to Valeria now. So Valeria, perhaps given your role, you can give us a little bit of your view on the European model of social dialogue, and highlight where cooperation between social partners is working particularly well in that model.
Yes, thank you very much, Glenda. Thank you for the invitation. I will answer your question and also come back to what Klaus Michael said, because I think your discussion, you were not contradicting each other. You were pointing out two different reality when it comes to skills and training. So the beauty and the strength, I think, of the European social dialogue and the model is that European social partners can have a great power if they accept to exercise it, because we can be quasi-legislator. You know, you can sign up agreement that can be transformed into a directive or applied by our respective members at the national level according to their different national industrial relations system. That is why you see that there is a different involvement in different countries, because of course where social dialogue, collective bargaining is not strong, you can't have an effective system. The implementation of those agreements is more difficult to be reached. And this is valid for whatever aspect of working condition, training and skilling, upskilling included. We have another strength that we have been using more and more, sometimes overusing, but is a very tempting power to use, which is the one of tripartite social dialogue, because since the 2008 crisis, we have been involved more and more in shaping not only social policies, but also economic governance, industrial system, etc., etc. Why I mention this? Because as you mentioned at the very beginning, Glenda, skills and skills development is clearly one of those issues where social partners alone can't reach the result, which does not mean that they are not the one who needs to shape the instrument since the start. And here I absolutely agree with Klaus Michael that we are the best place, because we are the one who will have to use the skills on either side of the table at the workplace. So it's very important that we are at the very beginning of shaping and understanding what is necessary. But in order for this to become reality, we need public authorities, either at the national, regional, local, whatever level. And here I would say, I would add one part of competence to the list that you mentioned at the beginning, Glenda. There is Ministry of Education, Labor, Innovation. There is also Ministries of Finance, which are very often the less, I would say, the most reluctant to invest in skills and education, that is still seen as a cost and not as an investment. So this is for the environment in which we have to operate at the European level, but also in the reality of our membership in the national, regional level. What you mentioned and the fact that studies show that not always this magic recipe function is due, in my opinion, to the fact that on both sides, employers and trade unions, and maybe mainly on employers, because we are the one who have the power of first initiative, so to say, to decide what is necessary in the company to be developed. We are still too much fixed into this skill matching paranoia, I would say. We still want to find the very specific skill for the very specific profile. And this is absolutely not possible, not anymore possible, because the pace of change is too fast. And we speak very much about employability, but when it comes to skills, we are not yet there. So we think employability, but we act employment for this very job at this very moment. And that's, I think, the reason why studies show that this match is not yet there.
Thank you very much, Valeria. Absolutely, very good point, especially the last one. And now I would like to give the floor to Manfo from South Africa. South Africa is often cited as a country, and Anya mentioned it in her presentation, where social partnership in skill policies works particularly well. And so I'm interested, like somebody also in the conversation mentioned, you know, context and conditions to make effective social partnership happen in the upskilling and reskilling context. And so what do you think created these particular conditions in South Africa?
Thank you so much, Glenda, and I hope that I'm audible. Yes, in South Africa, we have what we call the National Economic Development and Labour Council, formerly known as NEDLAC, which is a representation or representative and consensus-seeking statutory body established in law through the National Economic Development and Labour Council Act. So this council facilitates sustainable economic growth, greater social equity at the workplace and in communities, and from our perspective as government, it facilitates for consultation around the policies that we are developing and publishing as and when is required. And in our case, the latest ones that I was involved was with regards to the economic reconstruction and recovery plan scale strategy, where we had to ensure that we consult quite extensively with government, other government departments, where we consult with organized labor, where we consult with organized business, and most importantly, with communities as well. And we also engage quite extensively with regards to the critical skills list that we are producing in a consultation or in collaboration with the Department of Home Affairs, which is a list that assists us in areas where we are unable to find people with the right skills in the country. We can begin to make sure that we're getting those skills outside of South Africa. And some of the key interventions that have been highlighted in both the skills strategy and the critical skills list in the main, it's about ensuring that we upskill and reskill those that have lost jobs in areas or in sectors that were impacted quite negatively by the COVID-19 pandemic. You may also be aware that in South Africa, we're going through what we call continuous load shedding, where in a day we might be without electricity, 4 times or 3 times a day. This has negatively impacted economic activity in the country. People have lost jobs, and also some companies have closed down. So there is an agency in terms of ensuring that we are accommodating or we are absorbing those that have lost jobs in sectors that shows a potential for growth, particularly just energy transition. We know it's something big worldwide in South Africa as well. So we're trying to make sure that people get to be upskilled, reskilled, trained, or retrained, if I were to use that term, in areas where they stand a better chance of finding employment. So there's really great initiatives happening through the council that I've just mentioned, where we're engaging with organized labor, organized business, communities, as well as other government departments to ensure that we're finding solutions for people to be absorbed into the labor market, particularly the youth, as we're having the highest, I think, level of unemployment in South Africa or across the world, Glenda, if I were to put it that way. But in addition to that, in South Africa, we have what we call, as Anna has mentioned, we have what we call the sector education and training authorities, which are like an intermediary between the between education and training on the one hand, as well as employment on the other hand. They are funded by the taxes that a business pay, especially those that have a revenue of more than 500,000. And this is in the main geared towards training of their staff in various companies in South Africa. And the SETAs also play quite an important role because they also accredit skills development providers to actually provide quality training programs to both workers as well as work seekers. So they also assist in terms of ensuring that there's work integrated learning. They provide learnerships, they provide apprenticeship. And in most of our colleges, our technical vocational education and training colleges, they've established what we call strategic integrated programs, which is SIPs in short term, where businesses are established within our TVET colleges for key qualifications that are aligned or that have been identified as critical to response to the occupations that have been identified as being in demand or in scarcity in the country. Thank you, Glenda. Hello. Okay.
Sorry, something very true that you said, excellent points. I was saying something very true that you said, that if anything, the emergence of skill shortages, the current situation has brought more focus on skills, more willingness to invest in training as well because of the lack of workers for some sectors. And to follow up on that, Manfo, I think in South Africa, in the South African context, you are making efforts to identify the skills needed for the green transition in particular, which you're calling the hydrogen economy. Can you tell us a bit more about that? So how you're identifying upcoming skills profiles and skill needs in that context?
Yes, thank you for that, Glenda. We've actually just hosted a roundtable on skills as an enabler for the development of the hydrogen economy on Monday and Tuesday. And the main aim of that roundtable was to begin to establish a collaboration across all the role players, across government departments, across academia, across business, and also working in close collaboration with the embassies as well. We also had the OECD represented there because we know that in our country, as in other countries across the world, hydrogen economy is gaining momentum and fast becoming a key component of our country's development trajectory. And there is a growing need to therefore begin to identify the skills, the knowledge, the attributes that are likely to be required in this new sector to ensure that skills are not a constraint to the growth of the hydrogen economy. So we see this role as huge. We see this role as something that cannot be implemented by government itself. So there's quite an agency to ensure that we coordinate and collaborate with various social partners in the country. So we know that as the Department of Higher Education and Training mandated to provide an oversight role over education and skills development in the country, we will then need to begin to provide signals to our universities, to provide signals to our colleges on the kinds of courses and programs that they should offer the transition to the new energy sector. And again, we know that in South Africa, we have two departments of education, one responsible for post-school education and training, while the other is responsible for the schooling system. So the two departments need to also ensure that career advice steers students to study in areas identified as being important for the energy sector. Our sector education and training authorities as well, and the National Skills Fund can actually play a key role in supporting skills development for the hydrogen economy. They can also fund and facilitate reskilling and upskilling programs for workers who are likely to be affected by the transitioning from a carbon economy to a green economy as well. So there is a role of business as well, Glenda, who could actually ensure the expansion of opportunities for internships, for learnerships, for apprenticeships, and provide bursaries and scholarships for the missing middle, what we call the missing middle in South Africa, linked to the hydrogen economy. So they can also establish dedicated training centers to provide technical skills and on-the-job training for high-level skills in demand. And then for the organized labor, I think the critical role that they play, especially when we're engaging with them, is that we want to ensure that we establish what we call an inclusive labor absorbing transition in South Africa, where we're saying that where there's potential for sectors to create employment opportunities, there needs to be such that they just are not targeted at high-end skills, but also creating elementary occupations, taking into account that the majority of the people in our population, particularly those that are not in employment, education, or training, have lower levels of qualifications or lower levels, or what we call in South Africa, secondary, not completed as their highest level of education attainment. So there is an agency in terms of ensuring that we are agile in creating opportunities that will enable them to find employment in real time. Thank you, Glenda.
This so far we've talked about social dialogue in general terms, and we've brought up in the various examples various aspects of social dialogue, but maybe we could narrow it down a little bit and now talk about collective bargaining agreements. So Anja mentioned in particular the Swedish case, and so maybe Claes Michael, you can tell us a bit more. I think you hinted at it already in your first intervention. You can tell us a bit more how this collective agreement was signed and why do you think the negotiations succeeded?
Thank you very much. And I should first say that this is probably a whole seminar in itself, just this agreement. So, but very briefly, very shortly, because I happen to be part of these negotiations that started 2.5 years ago, and it was very particular political and I guess institutional circumstances that made it possible. But what it was at the end of the day was a big negotiation between employers and trade unions, but also with government. So at the end of the day, sometimes it takes 3 to tango, not only 2, 3 to tango, and I think that's one of the lessons that came out of it. But so what came out of it was a very strengthened system for upskilling and reskilling. And many of the questions you all raised already were addressed in those negotiations. One of them, I think, is very important, and that is how you avoid that you end up in a paper tiger, if you so want. You get very good rights to training and things like that, but what you need at the end of the day is financing as well. It needs to be possible. I mean, you have to look at the reality of how it is, both from a worker's perspective, an employee, but also from a company. How do how do you fill the gap while the person is away? So that's one thing. You also need to have places where people can go training. So you set up a right to go train, but there is nowhere to go. There are no schools, there are no institutions to provide the training. And all these things were addressed in those negotiations, because I think what we wanted on both sides was something that was real, something that would make a difference and not only look good on paper. It was messy in many ways, like all compromises. It was not perfect, but I think we got out with something that was very important. We addressed also things that Valeria mentioned. I think is training a cost or an investment? That's really a key issue here, because if you go to each and every company, if they want to invest or not, well, why would you? If the risk is that the employee will leave as soon as the training is fulfilled. So you have to collectivize the training, which is a very difficult thing for employers to agree upon, because that means that they sort of lose control themselves. So that had to be addressed as well. But what came out on the other side, and it's not perfect yet, but it's up and running, is a system which provide a lot of opportunities for people. Each and every individual have very good opportunities now to go to change course in the work life. You could actually be away 1 year with full 80% of your wage. And change your course of your working life. But there is also a big component, a big part of it is that companies want to upskill and reskill can do that too. So everyone was happy at the end of the day, but it took an awful lot of compromise and exchange of pears and apples and carrots and ananases and everything. But it was good. But again, we probably need a whole day to go through it in detail. Thank you for letting me share a bit of that experience.
Thanks a lot. Very interesting. I think time is getting tighter, so I'm just inviting our speakers to be a bit to be brief. And so far, Pedro, we have talked about where social dialogue is working well. And it would be good now to look also at the challenges. I think you mentioned some of them at the very beginning, highlighting some aspects that are not yet working very well. But do you have anything to add to that list?
Yeah, I'll try to be quite succinct. Yes, of course, to promote social dialogue, we also need to identify where the difficulties are. And I think I was just taking some notes, and some of it has already been mentioned to a certain extent. I'll highlight a little bit. I think that one thing that we have been identifying in field work and work with constituents is that, for example, there is frequently lack of capacity of social partners to deal with skills issues. And this was part of the initial discussion that was starting to be born. That is a very interesting discussion in itself. And it's something that the ILO tries to address through its International Training Center in Turin, which the training is provided at this level, and more also with this orientation for the twin transition. I also took the note of that point on the matching obsession, which I found very good way of qualifying it. And yes, to a certain extent, yes. And to another extent also, I think that many enterprises do not see where the priorities should lie. There is no strategic attitude, especially in the smaller enterprise units. What we see through our work is that many enterprises do not value investments in green, for example, and even less in terms of the skills development in this area. And when dealing with digital, frequently the investments might not be the best or the most adequate for the present and the near future. And these are typical difficulties. But going also to other broader points also very quickly, this case of Sweden is really not the general case. This is not the general scenario. So what we see is that there is, in many countries, reluctance from behalf of governments in involving social partners, going for more than very basic levels of consultation. So not involving in planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. So all these deeper end aspects. Also, the fact that governments themselves internally do not coordinate very well across ministries and do not have broad coordinating policies is also not helpful to identify the points of engagement, the points of entry, and how to put these things together. So I imagine that was a great deal of the discussion in Sweden. We have some good examples, like Bangladesh is also a good example that we're proud of, let's say. But this is not the general case. Another aspect I would like to highlight is the resistance that also exists in, let's say, creating this sort of mixed financing models. You know, not all countries are as open as South Africa. Still, it's a developing process. These attitudes, this dialogue, this confidence takes time to be built, and a lot of work. And I would say that even when it happens, then the mechanisms which are put into place, what we see is that they're not necessarily engaging the social partners in all relevant dimensions of management, or transparency may be lacking. So this is also a bit of an issue. Lastly, I mean, I think that again we come back to the smaller enterprises issue needs to be addressed. Just very quickly on how this can be improved. I think that you know, social partners need to be engaged from sunrise to sunset in terms of policy decisions. So immediately when you start to identify, diagnose, elect priorities, you need to have social partners there. You need to have them through the whole process until you do the evaluation, complete the cycle with policy feedback and how you revise the measures. So for that, you also need to explore governance options that enable this and that are adequate to the context. Once again, this needs to be discussed and needs to be done in the context of broad coordinated policies. And I'll leave it at this because we're short on time. So, yeah.
Particularly, you know, the involvement of social partners from start to end. Very often that's done only as an afterthought once, you know, too late in the process. Valentina, any points on these? Or where do you think there is room for improvement? What could employers do better?
Yeah, Valeria, it's fine. Problem. I also like Valentina, no problem. I think, I mean, I said at the start what I think is still the wrong mindset on some employer side, which is this micromanagement of skills, if you want, reduced to skill and not be able to see the broad picture. But of course, I want to specify that this is not because there are necessarily good or bad employers. There are employers that are put in a more comfortable or less comfortable position. Those who are in a more comfortable position are in countries where there are conditions where employability as such is favored, where there are active labor market policies, where there are responsive public authorities that indeed see investment in skills as an investment, or as we heard the brilliant example from South Africa, where there is an acknowledgement that some sectors that are not, you know, completely neutral sectors, so you have to make a choice to say hydrogen is the future, is a political choice, but they are able to identify it and to bring the investment there, including investment in human capital. So in a way, we have to help the employer side to be more looking to this bigger picture and all the factors that can make training an investment for the future. And the last point I want to make on this is that there are some external conditions that make this investment particularly difficult. The sectors SGI's Europe represent are certainly not sectors that do not see the investment in green as the right investment, as a pertinent investment. Our sector will not survive simply if they do not invest in green energy, water, transport, to name waste management, to name only a few of them. But we face a reality whereas on the one side, there is the genuine political conviction that, for instance, an instrument like the Green Deal is the growth strategy for the future. And on the other side, our members at the ground are faced with constant uncertainty about the rules that are changing very quickly, rules that will change in the near future while they are investing just now in some practice. Taxonomy is one of those examples. Taxonomy is going to be something very, very good, the green taxonomy, but is a very unclear instrument yet. And so the reality on the ground is that when a company does not know what is going to be the reality in 10 years' time, and they risk to have to change completely their supply chain and their model of providing a service, this environment do not necessarily favor investment in human capital, which is something that has a long return in investment. So I would like to say with this that you have to understand that there are many conditions that can favor or hamper heavily investment in human capital, in skills in particular.
Yes, sorry, Valeria, I realize. Thanks a lot. And now I'll give the floor to Manfo from the government perspective on this. What is the biggest challenge, do you think?
Yeah, just adding on what Pedro has just said, the issue of ensuring that there is effective coordination across all role players still remain a challenge. There is still an element of silos mentality in terms of the approach that we're taking in the development of the policies or even in identifying the interventions. So that leads to the inefficiencies and the wastage of resources in the process. So from where I am sitting, I'm thinking that we actually need to establish appropriate coordination structures that will ensure that we do away with the silos approach to the development and implementation of policies. We do away with the duplication of efforts in terms of the work that we do, and we engage in such a way that there would be appropriate outcomes at the end of the day, ensuring that people are employed in jobs that are aligned to what they have studied, ensuring that the interventions that we're putting in place are responsive to the needs of the labor market and people are employed. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're a bit over time, but let's still open the floor for comments and questions. So to kick off a conversation with the audience, I'd like to give the floor to Jenny Serby, who is head of communications at the Swedish National Agency for Higher Vocational Education. There was actually a question just then among the participants about how about the Swedish agreement, how it could apply to other countries potentially. So Jenny, may I ask you, you're there to tell us a bit about your views from the government perspective on the cross-sectoral agreement on skills development and also on its implementation. And perhaps the question from the audience was how applicable it would be, how specific were the conditions in Sweden, or could they potentially be replicated in other countries?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Well, I represent higher vocational education in Sweden, and we find that it's a form very well suited to play an important role in the agreement that Klaus Michael talked about. So the system is a joint venture between employers, the state, and education providers. And the courses are eligible for student aid. And our students are slightly older, around 30 years on average. And our education providers, they're very used to manage questions like real competence, and they can offer short courses with the purpose of upskill and reskill. And the majority of these are available in the form of online courses, catering also to those who are already employed. And we can see there is a high level of interest from those groups. And since these courses became available, I think it's 2 years ago now, we've seen a growing interest, and there was an increase in demand from applicants when the Student Aid for Transition was launched last year. So funding is key, like many of you have already said. And there are currently, I think, 8,500 people enrolled. And when we ask the students, 4 out of 10 applicants state that they wish to become more attractive with reference to transitions of the labor market. So we are now monitoring this development to see if interest will remain high, but right now it seems so in this spring, summer. There are a lot of applicants who are reviewing our available courses. And I could just say that most popular are the courses within the field of economics and sales and construction. And so one challenge we have, which I think is also very prevalent in the Swedish educational system overall, is the very low interest in courses within the field of manufacturing and technology. And this is despite the substantial demand from employers. Not in least in connection with the green transition, there is a big demand from employers in these areas, but we have a hard time to find applicants. So we try to cooperate with employers to raise awareness and sort of attract students in larger numbers, but it is a challenge, I have to say. And I don't know I think the system we have where we cooperate between employers, education providers, and the state is quite unique for Sweden. But I think it's applicable in other systems as well, if you sort of copy it. It's been very successful in Sweden, and I think, I'm not going to brag, but 9 out of 10 students actually are employed 6 months after they graduate. So it's very successful. But we have, like I say, it's still a small part of the Swedish educational system. We have, I think, 70,000 students. So it's not as big as university, the university field.
There was another question, which I think we've addressed to some extent, how can we improve the collaboration between the social partners and government? I think Pedro did mention, for example, the involving social partners from the start, for example, from the very first step of assessing how skill needs are changing, which I think also links to what Valeria was saying, that we need to give particularly SMEs, but all companies in general, some level of certainty of how things are changing, to engage them in investments on the green and digital transition. But there is one question, I think, something we really haven't discussed, which is more related to youth. And the question is, are there any good practices in this context of the transition to create good jobs, quality jobs, entry jobs, and so for young people entering the labor market? I think it's a good question. We often find that the digital transition, for example, is affecting those entry jobs in particular because they require less influence, negotiation, less of those skills that can not be automated, which means that how do we foster the transition if those entry jobs have a tendency, at least in the context of the digital side of the twin transition, to disappear? Anybody wants to take this? I think, Manfo, you mentioned some collaboration with universities, and there was an element of youth in your intervention. You're muted, yeah.
Yes, I think what we have been doing and adopting in most of the discussions on consultations that we have is that we need to make sure that we include them in the discussions, even in the development of policies, because sometimes we make decisions for them. And at the very end, we go back to them and say, this is what we have determined to assist you in terms of finding employment. So it is very important that at a discussion level, even in forums such as the one that we're having right now, that we get to invite them so that we get to give them a voice as well. I think for me, that is quite critical, that we involve them in the discussions, that we allow them to come up with interventions that are suited to what they are experiencing or going through right now. But I think there's quite a lot of initiatives that we have in South Africa. Through our presidency, we have what we call the Presidential Youth Intervention Forum, where in various schools we're creating, supporting, I forgot the exact word that they use, but they're supporting teachers, you know, in terms of the day-to-day activities that are happening in the classrooms. There are initiatives where we have a pathway management network, hoping to connect them with the employers as well, because what we have, some of the challenges that our youth go through in South Africa is the fact that they don't have the right networks, is the fact that they don't even have data to begin to look for employment opportunities. So through the Pathway Management Network, we're providing them with a platform to actually register themselves where it's data free. They don't actually require data for some of the websites that have been established, so that it's easier for them to register and connect with employers, and in some instances to even connect with people that can assist them with putting together a resume. For some of our youth, that it's still a challenge. They don't know how to go about putting together a resume. They don't know how to prepare for interviews. So we're creating different layers and interventions to make sure that we're preparing the youth, depending on the different challenges that they are experiencing.
Thanks a lot. Well, I think we'll go straight to the conclusions now. Since we are already a bit over time, I won't summarize the discussion. It would be very difficult. It's been so interesting with so many concepts raised, but I think there was broad agreement, you know, both that social dialogue plays a key role, but also on the areas where some improvement may be needed, in particular involving the social partners from the start, dealing with challenges of underrepresented groups in upskilling and reskilling, or the groups that are most affected, which unfortunately tends to overlap. The specific needs of small and medium enterprises, for example, and some excellent examples already, like the examples of South Africa and the example of Sweden that we have heard from, and also the example that Valeria gave us. I think you can all find, as we said before, the brief online, so feel free to access it. We have the link in the chat, and there are many more examples highlighted in the brief. The brief is only part of a large body of work that we are doing on the green and digital transition. As many of you know, the Global DL Forum last year had a significant focus on the green transition. We're also working on a policy brief, so that will be one of the next policy briefs to be launched on the just transition, probably after the summer. And we also have a case study on the platform economy, which touches upon some of the challenges related to the digital transition and the future of work. In the meanwhile, of course, the ILO, the OECD, also the governments represented here, and the social partners are working on their side on the twin transition. So I think today we very much agreed that we should continue this conversation and work together to make the most of the transition. I'm going to thank now our panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time to participate. Thank you very much to Anya also as the author of the brief, and thanks to all the participants. Have a great day or evening, depending where you are, and we'll be in touch for the next webinar. Thanks a lot.